everyone! Thank you for joining me today. I'm Ranger Alyssa, the park interpreter for Redcliffe Plantation State Historic Site. This is our second stop for our Juneteenth programming. If you haven't watched the first part already, scroll down a bit on our Facebook page and check out Hampton Plantation's post. If you are unfamiliar with Redcliffe Plantation State Historic Site, it was originally owned by James Henry Hammond. He was a South Carolina governor, but also a senator, and this was his home. This is also the home for many generations of enslaved African Americans and their free descendants. Juneteenth is also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, Liberation Day, and Emancipation Day. This day, June 19th, is a day to celebrate and commemorate the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States. The first celebration of Juneteenth occurred in Texas on June 19, 1865, years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation and months after the end of the Civil War. Some of our records from Redcliffe, including a diary entry from Betty Hammond Eve, pose the question of how emancipation would affect their enslaved individuals. However, we see that life did not change for the enslaved people. They were not taught to read or write, and the Hammond family certainly did not tell them that Lincoln intended to free them. Here at Redcliffe, that freedom did not actually come until the end of the Civil War in 1865. For most of the Confederate states, freedom did not begin until the end of the Civil War. Following that, families and individuals started to look for lost loved ones. Being separated from family, children, parents, siblings, that was a very real possibility during slavery. So once they were free, they started to look for those individuals that they'd been separated from. One way that we are able to learn about life post-emancipation is to look at the slave narrative collection. This was part of the Federal Writers Program that took place in the 1930s, part of the New Deal initiatives. The slave narratives were a series of interviews recorded from 1936 to 1938 across 17 states. This was just over 70 years after emancipation. Although it was an initiative with good intentions behind it, there were some issues. Memory recall, as it was 70 years after emancipation, the means by which the interviews were obtained were not always the best, and undue pressure was placed on the interviewees and interviewers. One of these interviews actually applies to James Henry Hammond, the first owner of Redcliffe. Anson Harp, who was originally born on a Mississippi plantation, recalled that when he was a child, he and 3 other children were put on a wagon by an unknown white man and told that they would be leaving Mississippi. He recalled his family crying and the parents of the other children crying, but they had no power to stop the separation. Eventually, when the enslaved were freed, Anson was given the choice to either keep his previous owner's last name, Harp, or take Hammond's last name. Anson Harp kept the Harp name because that's the last place his parents had been when they were separated. Keeping connections, like last names, like now, made it easier to find lost family members. Unfortunately, Anson was never able to reconnect with his parents. Whether the newly freed people had reconnected with family or not, it was a necessity for them to work, almost as it had always been. Ranger Stephanie at Rose Hill will talk more about the work these individuals were doing and the work contracts they joined. These newly freed individuals did not do this same work, this same labor because they wanted to. They were inhibited by black codes, and black codes were meant to keep the status quo. They were, as their name suggests, codes that enforced black people to do the work that the whites wanted. The black codes were the precursor to the Jim Crow laws and Jim Crow era. And they meant that many of the newly freed people were doing the same work that they had always been doing. And that meant working in the fields or doing domestic labor. Here we have an example of a newly freed person, a child named Buren, and he was doing some of the same work that the children would have been doing when they were enslaved, which was carrying water buckets from a water source to the people working in the field. If you take a look around with me, around this house, you'll see that these walls and the flooring are very old, and that's because the enslaved workers who lived here would have been doing this work. That meant they had many skills like woodworking, brick making, and sometimes metalwork. So even those who had skills were forced to work in the fields and do domestic labor. The Black Codes, which started in South Carolina and Mississippi, were a series of laws meant to keep the status quo and specifically targeted Black people and their new freedoms, or at least the freedoms they should have received. One of those laws was that no person of color could work in any field outside of farm labor and domestic labor, unless they had an approved permit or license granted by a judge. That permit had to be purchased and renewed annually. The likelihood of a newly freed person being able to purchase one of those licenses or permits was very slim. The jobs they were allowed to do based on the Black Codes did not pay much money, and again, many of their employers were not interested in the Black people making significant sums of money. Another Black Code was a vagrancy law. If you were found to not have a job or residency, you could be arrested. Instead of going to jail, people had to work off what would have been time incarcerated. That labor would have been on a farm or plantation, doing the same work they'd done while enslaved, and again, not receiving pay for that labor. The Black Codes defined the rights, or the lack of rights, for the newly freed people. They were meant to keep the Black people as low as possible in the system and have them remain as essentially enslaved. Although this building behind me looks like a garage now, it used to be one of the enslaved cabins here at Redcliffe Plantation. It was actually the home of one of the many families here, enslaved families here, called the Wigfalls. Despite the attempts to keep the status quo using the Black Codes, there are records of some people coming into success, like the Wigfall family. The Wigfall family especially was able to beat the odds that were stacked against them. Dennis Wigfall, who was born in 1861, gained his freedom at the age of 4 in 1865. At the age of 18, he left Redcliffe and moved to Augusta, Georgia, just across the river. He started working as a porter for grocery companies. And after about a decade, he had gained enough skills and enough money to open his own companies, his own grocery businesses. And by the time he died in 1913 or 1914, he had 5 companies that he owned. And they passed on to his son, Clarence Wigfall. Clarence was just as successful as his father, and also became politically and socially active. He was the chairman for the Republican Party of Richmond County, but also he became an honorary member of the Postal Alliance and a deacon at the historic Springfield Baptist Church. Our other rangers will be introducing you to more families and more stories about emancipation here in South Carolina. Thank you for joining us here at Redcliffe today, and please enjoy the Juneteenth programming.